It is my esteemed pleasure to welcome you all to today's program. So ahlan wa sahlan and welcome everybody. My name is Dave Serio and I oversee the education department at the Arab American National Museum, which is the first and only museum of its kind that's dedicated to telling the story, history, and culture of the Arab American community, which is located in the beautiful Dearborn, Michigan, which is also home to the largest concentration of Arab Americans in the country. We recognize that the Arab American National Museum sits and resides in Anishinaabe land and is located in the region with the highest concentration of Arab Americans in the nation. We also acknowledge our neighboring city, Detroit, as Anishinaabe territory and other indigenous peoples' land, as well as being the largest majority Black city in the nation, with a long legacy of African diasporic contributions. Together, we uplift the larger ethnic and racial fabric of our local, national, and international communities. So again, thanks everybody so much for joining us for today's program, the National Youth Summit, which is focused this year on gender equity. The National Youth Summit is a program that is put on in conjunction with the Smithsonian Museum. So the Arab American National Museum is a Smithsonian affiliate. So we work very closely with the Smithsonian Museum, which is located in Washington, D.C. And every year they host conversations about important events in America's past that have relevance in our current situation and into the future. And then this year's theme is focused, of course, on gender equity. So in alignment, kind of before we get started, so the museum is committed to creating an art sector rooted in justice. And we are committed to ensuring a space that is free of classism, transphobia, homophobia, Islamophobia, ableism, misogyny, sexism, classism, and other biases. It is our expectation that folks who engage in our programs, whether in person or online, will abide by these and honor these ethics. Lastly, before we jump into the program, I just want to mention that today's program, I hope you'll see as an opportunity not only to learn, but an opportunity to participate and ask questions. So please see this as a very safe space where you can ask questions, bring up things that maybe you've always wanted to ask or that you've always had curiosities about. So feel free to speak up and participate as you'd like. We'll have a few spaces in the program to ask questions and a couple of activities. If you'd like to ask a question during the program, you can drop it into the chat and or raise your, oops, sorry, I lost my page, and or raise your hand virtually, and we'll be sure to call on you. Our hope for this program is to make it as conversational as possible, right? Nobody wants to listen to just people talking at you, so feel free to, again, ask questions and participate. Today's program will be recorded and will only be used by the Arab American National Museum and the Smithsonian for educational purposes. There will be a survey that we'll be doing at the very end of the program, which I'll drop into the chat towards the end and or send via email if that's easier. Please take a couple minutes to share your honest and anonymous feedback with us. And I believe that is it. So now I have the esteemed pleasure of introducing our wonderful panelists and our moderator, which I'll start with. So our moderator for today is Petra El-Soufi, who is a dear personal friend of mine and also one of the brains behind the development of this program. So shouting out Petra for not only being a moderator, but also the brains behind today's program. So Petra is the Outreach and Partnerships Manager at the Institute for Social Policy and Understanding, or ISPU, which is a really great resource if you're interested in learning more about the Muslim American community, where she strengthens valued partnerships and forges new ones with organizations who share ISPU's goal of strengthening Muslim communities and building understanding. Petra's work includes working with ISPU's large network of scholars and sharing research with policymakers, community leaders, faith leaders, educators, and the general public to equip them to make informed decisions about American Muslims. Petra is a Detroit Equity Action Lab Racial Equity Fellow and an alum of New Detroit's Multicultural Leadership Series. She also serves as the Vice President of the Michigan Center for Civic Engagement's Board of Directors and as a member of the American Association of State and Local Histories Religious History Committee. Petra has been a leader in interfaith work and public education for more than 15 years and is a graduate of Grand Valley State University, where she earned a BA in political science. welcome Petra. Thanks for joining us today. On to our amazing speakers and panelists. First is Hisna Mukhtar. She is the postdoctorate associate at Rutgers University Center for Women's Global Leadership. She holds a PhD from Clark University, and her dissertation focused on narrative power and the invisible trauma of gendered violence in Kuwait. She is a scholar, researcher, and activist with expertise on the Arabian Gulf, focusing on narratives of Muslim survivors of gender-based violence. After graduating in 2015 with an MA in International Development and Social Change, Hisna developed a passion for transdisciplinary approaches to addressing violence in Muslim communities. Her writings have been published in mainstream media such as Fortune and Yahoo, and in academic journals such as Feminist Review and Feminist Anthropology. Previously, Hisna served as the executive director of the Center for Nonviolent Solutions in Worcester, Massachusetts, and more recently as the special program director at Peaceful Families Project. She is passionate about life, personal growth, spirituality, and everything in between. Welcome, Hisna. Thank you so much for being a part of today's program. And last but certainly not least, I'm very excited to introduce Sara Abbas, who is a Sudanese American and is a fellow of the Open Society Foundations, where she is undertaking a project on how ordinary people have engaged in new imaginations and practices of unmaking inequality in Sudan during the country's recent revolution. Her doctoral research, in contrast, looks at the role that women played in Sudan's Islamist movement during the years of dictatorship between 1989 and 2019. Sara has worked on and researched gender equity, including for UN Women. Her focus has been women's political participation in the MENA region, which is Middle East, North Africa region, and East Africa. Amongst her publications is a recent chapter in the book, A Region in Revolt, mapping the recent uprisings in North Africa and West Asia. Sara, thank you very, very much for joining us today.
Thank you.
So at this time, I'm going to mute myself and let our wonderful panelist and moderator take over. So Petra, I'm going to pass it over to you to get us started.
All right. Thank you, Dave. Thank you for putting this program on. One of my favorite programs, for a lot of reasons. One, because it's affiliated with Smithsonian, and this is a great way for the Arab American National Museum to connect with the Smithsonian and be part of the larger, story of the American experience, but especially because it focuses and it works with different schools. And then for this year, because of the topic, I mean, this is something that's, very passionate for me. So thank you for inviting me to be part of it and giving me a space here. So I'm going to turn the focus a little bit on our wonderful students and teachers. Thank you so much for joining us this morning. I know you're all using one laptop, but I'm going to ask a few questions. Feel free to either raise your hand, throw something in the chat if you feel comfortable, or just think about it. But I prefer that we engage with each other. We're going to have a lot of talking to do on our end, and it would be really, it will make this, a better experience for you and for us if this is a two-way conversation. So before we get into the topic of today, let's start with just asking you, I just want to get to know you a little bit better. How many of you have actually visited the museum before? Or yours? Okay, I see some, head shaking. So I'm assuming none from Liam's group.
Yeah.
That's okay, totally okay. So this is your first exposure. How many of you have either taken a course, training workshop, anything on, related to the topic of gender equity, either in school or anywhere else?
The class that we're doing this for actually is ethnic and gender studies, and so that is the reason why we took this opportunity to kind of broaden our horizons on these cultural topics.
Yeah.
Perfect. This is perfect. Yes. Okay, so this is great. This is going to be a great conversation. So this is a little bit more deeper question. If you feel comfortable, please do share. If you don't, completely fine. Just think about it as we get into our conversation today. The question is, have you ever been discriminated against based on something you can't control? So think about your own experience. If you feel comfortable, share. If you don't, that's okay. But I just want this question to stay with you.
Hi, I'm Isla. So I'm Muslim and I'm clearly white, which a lot of people have a problem with. So I get a lot of like really mean stereotype things said, or like you're not actually Muslim type of things, and kind of like really rude stuff, especially around 9/11. People like to mention, oh, like you won't get hurt by us saying like terrorist or like
Okay.
stereotypical or mean just because of my skin color. So they don't think that I'm Muslim enough. So there's that.
Thank you. Thank you so much for sharing that. And just a quick note on that. Part of our research is we do demographic profile of American Muslims, and it's actually the most ethnically diverse faith community in the nation. So you'll see Muslims of all ethnic and racial backgrounds, obviously including white converts, but also white Europeans. And so it's a fact. And religious bullying. Religious bullying in school is extremely high against Muslim students. Actually, 50% of American Muslim families report having a child who have experienced religious bullying because of their religious identity in school. So your experience, thank you for sharing it. Unfortunately, it's more common than we think. And the sad reality is actually 1 out of 3 cases of those bullying is by a teacher or an administrator. So I'll be doing a talk later about that if anyone wants to join and listen to it. So thank you for sharing that. I know we have another class. I believe Michelle's class is here. Oh, she is sharing. Okay. So Michelle is teaching, she's sharing here, EL, English learner students discriminated in predominantly white middle-class schools. Muslim students were labeled as terrorists in high school as a joke, and seriously, Islamophobia is high. Yes, so that is a fact. As a matter of fact, there are actually, I believe, at least 3 stories of really horrible religious-based bullying that's going on in the schools that are in the news cycle this week in different parts of the country. And like I said, one of them is by a teacher calling her students terrorists. We don't negotiate with terrorists. Others are, I don't remember the details, but there are at least three cases that are in the news cycle. Those are the ones that have made it to the news. One thing that I also want to bring up as we're talking more about Muslim students here, I want to make sure that we're also clear that not all Arabs are Muslims and not all Muslims are Arabs. I know this program is part of the Arab American National Museum, and the community, the makeup of the Arab American community right now is closer to 50-50, 50 Muslim, 50 Christian, but historically in the US context, it was predominantly a Christian community. So one is an ethnic group. Muslim is obviously a religious identity, and the Muslim Americans are, like I mentioned, are made up of people of all walks of life. So thank you all for sharing that. I want to hand over the mic to Hasna, who's going to lead us on activity right now, and then we'll dive deeper into the topic. Hasna, it's all yours.
Thank you so much, Petra and Dave, and pleasure to be here with you and with one of my favorite people in the world, Sarah. And thank you for giving me the opportunity. So based off of what Petra just shared, I'm just going to share my slides here to talk a little bit about something called intersectionality. It's a theory, it's a framework that we use in research when we're discussing gender equity, gender injustice, gender inequality, and all of these issues in the world. So just give me 1 second to please share my slides. So Intersectionality is basically a theory that Black feminists in the United States came up with because they've realized that Black women experience oppression in a different way than white women, than other groups of people. And so it started with the Combahee River Collective, and then Kimberly Crenshaw basically she's a lawyer, she's a professor and a spokesperson, and she kind of solidified the idea. So what is intersectionality? It's made up of 3 building blocks: our social identities, who we are, and I'm going to get into that in a minute; systems of oppression in the world, which Dave alluded to, like Islamophobia, sexism, heterosexism, all of these systems, and the ways in which our social identities and these systems intersect and create certain experiences for people in the world. So social identities based on the group of communities that the person belongs to. Again, I'm going to give more examples in a bit. Systems of oppression, I just mentioned examples, and how these two intersect and interact. To make this more visibly easier to understand and digest, we're going to talk about the power or privilege and oppression wheel. So you have this wheel. At the center, there is power. And then the closer you are to the center, the more privilege and the more power you have. And the further away from the center of this power, the more you experience oppression, discrimination, based on these different identities that we have and these social structural issues. So for example, we have age. What age do you belong to? What culture do you come from? Is it non-Western or Western? Do you have any issues, any people with disability that experience the world differently? Your education, your ethnicity, so on and so forth. And then you have all these systems of oppression on the outside of the wheel, and that's where the violence happens and the marginalization. I hope this is clear. I'm going to give more examples, and we're going to get back to this wheel so we can take a minute to kind of reflect on our own social identities. Another way to look at it in terms of gender-based violence is that these are different examples how people experience violence in the world differently. So you have a cisgender, first-generation university student who's Aboriginal will experience gender-based violence differently from a lesbian who's a single mom and a college student, from a Muslim who's an immigrant and full-time employee. Even though they're all subjected to gender-based violence, their identities and how that intersects with the lived experience is completely different. I hope that's easy, or at least is understandable. So I'll use myself as an example. So what are my identities in this world based on the wheel, or what matters to me the most and what I feel like that informs my lived experience? I am both Saudi by nationality, by citizenship, and American. I identify as a survivor of violence, sexual violence, physical violence, all of that. I'm a Muslim woman, a practicing Muslim woman. I come from a dominant group of the Sunni Muslim. I wear the hijab. I'm a feminist. I'm an advocate. I work in the field. I'm divorced. I'm a single mom. I come from a middle-class family. I'm an Arab, light-skinned Arab. I'm meaning I'm not Black. I have a PhD. I'm able-bodied. I'm cisgender, and I belong to the Zennial generation. And I speak first Arabic language and English. So some of these, depending on the context where I'm at, some of it can be put me in a position of oppression. For example, as a Muslim woman who wears the hijab in this world, especially as heightened Islamophobia, I'm visibly Muslim, so I'm subjected to more Islamophobia. That's one example. At the same time, I'm not Black, so I might experience less of racism and Islamophobia at the same time. So that's how the different people experience the systems differently. I have a PhD, so that puts me in a place of privilege, extremely privileged, being able to be in the U.S. Academy and have that status. At the same time, as a Saudi who's researching the region with so many stereotypes, as a survivor of violence, I've experienced also oppression within the academic world. So this is how this is why this is important to understand about ourselves and about the system that we interact with. So I would Take a
Hasna,
moment.
sorry, I'm going to interrupt you. There's a question about what is cisgender. Can you help define it for the students?
Cisgender, I'm sorry about that, is basically that you're straight, that you're interested in the opposite sex, and that you identify as your birth, like you're born with a gender and a sex, and you identify with that. So that's it. So I'm going to ask you to take a few minutes. We're going to just look at the wheel and try to identify your own social identities based on this wheel, and think of other systems of oppression that you might have experienced. And if you're happy to share, I would love to hear from you.
Should we do like 5 minutes for this? Okay, we'll do 5 minutes for you. So I think Hasna just dropped a link to that color wheel, so you could access it a little bit better we'll give you a couple more minutes to continue the exercise. I'm doing it myself. And then I hope we have a few volunteers who can share. Do we need more time to finish the activity, or are we all done? Thumbs up if you need more time. Okay, so y'all are done. Okay. Hasna, do you want to debrief, or do you want me to go ahead and do that?
Yeah, please, if you want to take over for turn, please.
Okay. So first of all, reactions to the activity. Not what did you get, but what's your reaction to just the activity itself? And you could drop in the chat if you don't want to speak, but I know you guys are brave. Come on. I know Michelle here put in the chat, we've had a great conversation about what being different than straight would be like in their country. I'm assuming because her students are English learners. And also the similarities are that big cities are accepting while villages and small towns are not. Also, older generations are not. Also, there is separation between church and sexuality. So, you know, that's a reaction from Michelle's group. What about I'm going to say Liam's group? Any reactions to the activity itself?
I don't know, at least for me, it felt like a really great way to just, you know, look at where my own privileges are.
Okay.
Just, I don't know, overall, I just felt like a good way to analyze myself, you know? I feel like that's kind of weird.
Yeah. No, was anyone surprised by what they end up finding about themselves? I was, so I'll start. I actually wrote it down, and interestingly enough, I put two categories. One where it will, you know, allow me more privilege, so a little bit the closer to the center of power, And then the other column is the ones further from the center of power. And interestingly enough, I had equal points in both sides, which I did not assume that about myself. So that was a nice surprise. But the things that were the things that made, or the things that were in the column further away from the center of power are the things that are more visible about me, and you know, allowed for more I guess for more, I don't want to use the word target, but allowed me to stand out more and be otherized more, if that makes sense. So like for example, you know, being female, that's something that, you know, is there. I'm from a non-Christian religious background, but not only that, but like visibly, you know, dressed as someone who's not from a non-Christian religious background. So those are two things. I'm clearly non-Western, non-European. Even though I'm citizen, I am always associated as an immigrant because I did come. Anyway, so a lot of things that make me stand out more are the ones that put me in the further away from the center of power. But the things that were closer to the center of power are more, I would say, less visible. And so internally, I guess that allows me to, it's making me realize I probably have more power than I think, but for others, they might not see that in me. Does that make sense? So that was a nice surprise, and it's good to see that in on paper. Anyone else want to share what they found out about themselves, if you feel comfortable? Okay, that's completely fine. So please keep this activity in mind and reflect on, and the purpose of the activity is not to make you feel one way or the other. It is to help you learn more about yourself. The more we learn about ourselves when it's in relation to anything that we do in life, the more we have control over who we are, the actions we take, how we interact with others, and at least in places where people might be sharing that our actions or words or you know, activities or whatever might be causing harm to them. The more you know about yourself, the more you're able to pause and listen to what the other is sharing, because you know, if you know, for example, that you're, let's say you're an able-bodied, and someone who might have a disability, even if it's not visible, is telling you this place is not accessible to me, but it's accessible to you, right? This is powerful for you and for me to pause and say, you know, I don't know how they feel. I don't know how they experience the place because I don't have the obstacle that they do. Okay, so this is the benefit of having an exercise like this, to allow you to know more about yourself, have control over what you do and what you say and how you make space for others, but also allow you to pause and listen to what others are sharing with you and why they're sharing it with you.
Can I add something, Petra, quickly? I think it's also
absolutely
important for solidarity when we are trying to support other people in their own struggles, to, when you're aware of where can you utilize your own privilege as whatever it is to support people who are struggling with oppression. That's another way to kind of look at it, because sometimes we have so many, as you said, Petra, this was surprising to you because we run around with so many privileges that we're unaware of, we take for granted, and so it kind of becomes a blind spot for us.
Yeah. Yes, and absolutely to keep your own privilege in mind, whatever that privilege. I didn't know I had some of these privileges because I have experienced so many things that made me not a privileged person, that I thought I didn't have any power over, and you know, over a lot of things. But looking at this list, I'm like, you know what? No, I actually have more control in certain areas than I thought I did. So you know, it's a learning tool for yourself. So we're gonna jump now into a deeper discussion about the topic. It's good to learn about ourselves. Let's learn about the history a little bit of the movement for gender equity in both the Arab world and in the Arab American communities and experience. So I'm going to start with you, Hasna. You just walked us through this activity. Can you just walk us briefly through when did the movement for gender equity started in the Arab world, and when did it come to the Arab American context?
So that's a very loaded question, because oftentimes than not, when we talk about equity and feminism and activism, we immediately assume that it started with the first wave of feminism that started in the United States with Gloria Steinem and all the kind of marches that they've done and everything. However, in that narrative, there's a lot of erasure for a lot of other forms of activism to demand gender equity in the Arab world that started even way before that. Unfortunately, these stories don't get highlighted, don't get centered, because again, going back to the power and who gets to dictate the narrative, this is the result of it. So I'm just going to share again my slides just to give examples of quickly of some historical feminist figures that are kind of illustrate my point. So this is Asma Nanu Asma, and she lived between 1793 and 1865. She was a teacher, a poet, a prolific writer, and an Islamic leader. And she lived in what is now known as northern Nigeria at the time. She's a daughter of Sheikh, his name Osman Dafodio, the founder of the Sokoto Caliphate. And from her early education, she taught, she was taught and she was exposed to being like the person she grew up to be. And when she became given the authority, she didn't even were given an authority. She actually transformed the tradition for women to be teachers of Islamic religious knowledge. She not educated children, educated men and women, and established something called the Yan Ataru, which is a school for women teachers who traveled to rural areas to improve Hausa women's education. Her readings and her writings continue to be taught, read, memorized, and recited. So that's one example of how, and that even goes way far before the first wave of feminism have started. I mean, usually the first wave of feminism is situated between 1848 and 1920. And so Asma Nanu was living between 1793. So that's way before. But again, that doesn't get recognized and celebrated as well. Another person I want to talk about is Huda Sha'rawi, who lived between 1879 and 1947. She is the founder of the Egyptian Feminist Union, founded on March 6, 1923, which was basically the first nation-wide feminist movement in Egypt. She grew up in a very conservative household, and then eventually she led this revolution within her country. That's another example that I wanted to share. Something else that I discovered also in my own research, my PhD research in Kuwait, that sometimes even the way we talk about equity has to be this grand, westernized idea that has to match certain expectations, like equity in the workplace or this and that. But sometimes when you look deeper, there are simpler, invisible, unnoticed forms of resistance that women can take upon themselves that can convey gender equity as well. And an example of that is when I was in Kuwait. I met this woman, her name is Awaish al-Qahtani, and she identifies as Bedouin, people who come from tribal backgrounds, who have lived as nomads in the deserts, but then now moved into the modern way of living, but they still continue to identify as Bedouins. You can call them the indigenous people of Kuwait. And so she was very upset about how the global feminist movement continues to marginalize certain acts of feminism that is not taken as seriously. And she gave me an example. So she said, in early Bedouin cultures, and still existing in some families today, women tended to prepare lunch and serve it to the men in the house first. And while they waited to eat something called the sur, which is the leftovers. So they put the food and they wait until the men are finished eating, and then they would come to eat afterwards. And so this woman decided that she wanted to change this custom as a way of protesting this, patriarchal culture. And so what she did is that she refused to, after serving the men lunch and while the other women kept to the custom of the sur, she prepared the dish for herself and ate in the kitchen. And Arwaisha was telling me that was her victory at that moment, her very simple victory that she kind of resisted in her own ways. So when we think about the history of gender equity, I give some examples, and that first we need to think of who doesn't get counted in the Arab world historically and in the modern times from the fight against gender inequality and inequity. And number two, what types of actions do we consider? Does it have to be grand? Yes, it's important to protest, it's important to lobby, it's important to stand firmly against oppression in a grand way, but it's also important to redefine how we think about what is gender equity. And I'm going to stop here.
I love that example because for a long time, even though I've had that passion about gender equity in me, I believe as back as as I was a child, but starting to learn more about the feminist movement in schools here, which unfortunately does not include women movement and gender movement of other countries until you get to college. I didn't realize how much erasure was done about my own history and culture, and so I started I'm also disassociating myself from my own background for a while until I got to college and we learned more about other cultures and other, which is just really funny way to put it, and other, gender movement. And I started paying attention to my own background and actually women in my own family and some of the small tasks that they did or small actions that really changed a lot of things for people around them, and were part of the equity movement, but they're definitely not going to be seen or presented as part of the larger conversation. So I really love that example. It's so small and so it's so easy to skip, but when you have a full appreciation of cultural background and what culture plays a role in, and sometimes the role of, and I keep using men and women because that's not exclusive, but it's easier to have that conversation. The role of sometimes of women to change small things within their families and their own communities, or on the other hand, for sometimes of women to be part of, to not only be victims, but also to uphold a patriarchal system. So I'm gonna, this is a good transition to ask Sarah, what is gender equity movement all about? Who's part of it and who's not? Is it just liberation for women? Walk us through that.
Okay, thank you so much, actually, to everybody. I'm really excited to have two, my nieces are in 8th and 9th grade, and we're always having conversations about these topics. So it's really great. I think it's been a painful couple of years, but for me personally, like one of the best parts about it is that I've realized that we can connect like this. I've connected with people all around the world that I normally wouldn't have had the imagination or the platform to speak with. So thanks again for being here today and for inviting me. I think already so much has been said. And I really appreciate actually Petra mentioning the word patriarchy, because for me personally, this is a word that I think about a lot more than thinking about, women's movements, which is what often this topic is reduced to, or women's rights, or even gender equality. As Dave mentioned, I'm from Sudan. Sudan is a country in Northeast Africa. I was born there. I spent the first 12 years of my life there. And then there was a military coup in 1989, and coming from a family that's very politically active in the union movement there, because of the imprisonment of my father and a lot of political repression, we ended up migrating to the US. So I'm 43 now, years old now, but at the time, this was 1990. And it was a big moment for the world generally, because also the fall of the Berlin Wall, a lot of things were happening around that time. And I think a lot of it has shaped the way that I think about this topic. And I will return to myself later. It's a little bit less easy for me. Hasna and I also have a lot of conversations to talk from my place of myself, but I will do my best. And I've actually done some work in the last couple of years to reflect on my own identity, and I will share some of that with you. But to talk about this issue of patriarchy, I think for me, the key question is, I was kind of coming out of the more traditional understanding of feminism, which is that, it's about women, it's about women's rights, it's about our equality. It was only a conversation about women and men, and it only spoke about how patriarchy is oppressive to women, or when I say women here, I mean people who identify as women, and it didn't include trans women, for example, in that conversation. Intersectionality that Hasna spoke about, for a large part of it, came up because women who identified as women but were not white were also excluded, whether they were indigenous women, from an understanding of what feminism is. So, as you know, most likely, the word patriarchy, it relates to the word patriarch. So its origin is actually very, very old. And the idea of the patriarch is, the father figure. So you see elements of this in our cultures today in the US as well, where, your mom might tell you, your dad is, away fighting somewhere, in the army, or, it's a single mother-headed household, and they would say, to the oldest son, you're the man of the house now. So the idea is that there is this male figure, and this male figure is the one that has the authority to set the framework for the family of behavior. But also, I'm someone who thinks it's very important to talk about gender equality from an economic standpoint, not just from a rights standpoint, because as we see in many different places, for example, in the US, women's rights have made a lot of strides when it comes legally. There's nothing legally that says women shouldn't be discriminated against. But we find that in places like the US, as in also in the Middle East and North Africa, women who are out there working, for example, to this day, on average, earn less money than men who do the exact same work. And within that, Black women, Asian women, Latinx women, Indigenous women earn less than white women. So this is where you see intersectionality still very much at play within both in the US and also within our region. Now, in the Middle East and North Africa, there's been a revolution in the sense that there have always been women who worked in the farms, in the factories, and so forth. But in the last 30 or 40 years, you see more and more and more and more women going into education and going into the workforce. However, you still find that the vast majority of women, for example, from my home country in Sudan, and this is the case across the region, are still very much concentrated in what you would call the informal economy. So this is informal work, meaning they're working in the markets, they're working in the fields, they're working in areas of the economy that are not protected by the law. They're not given minimum wage, they're not given benefits, they basically have very few rights. And there is a much larger concentration of women in these parts of the economy than there is of men, which continuously keeps them having to fight for their basic rights, but also in a very marginalized position. Now, to the question as to whether patriarchy is just about women, I mean, women identifying people, or more accurately, people who are identified as women by society, who are perceived as women, they are definitely the biggest, the ones who are most oppressed by the system of patriarchy. However, and I think this is really important, and this has really been important in terms of the kinds of thinking that has come out of feminism, it is very, very clear, if you read, for example, the work of African-American feminist Bell Hooks, whose work I really appreciate, because she spent a lot of her career speaking to men and speaking to men as well as to women. So I want to, for example, read you a quote. There's a book that she wrote, and I'll put a link to it. It's called The Will to Change. I really recommend anyone who identifies as male to read it, because I know it has transformed the thinking of quite a few of my friends. But in there, she really talks about why patriarchy is also oppressive to men, right? So men essentially are told that they have to uphold this system of patriarchy because, of course, it gives them power, it gives them a higher position, and that they have to defend it. But what is beautiful about this work is that it sort of analyzes the ways in which the system also really disadvantages men and causes pain to men as well. So basically, she says, just one second. So, so she basically speaks about the fact that she brings the example of young boys who are socialized in society. And she talks about the fact that if you don't behave in the way that you're supposed to behave, then other men usually they sort of enact rituals of violence against you to make you conform into a mode of behavior, right? And it's not just men. You hear phrases, for example, like you catch like a girl, for example. I remember this growing up whenever we were in, gym class, and like some guy would tell another guy, oh, you catch like a girl, and that would be really funny. So she essentially talks about the fact that if we reduce the fight against patriarchy only to a fight for women's rights, we miss out on the fact that the system is violent and hurtful to men and women, because it forces men as well to essentially, they're supposed to suppress their feelings in order to act in particular ways defined as masculine, right? And also it is oppressive to queer people and to gender non-conforming people who are also bullied into behaving in particular ways that are deemed acceptable. So while the fight is led across the world in terms of patriarchy by women, it's very important to understand that the issue of patriarchy creates a system of violence that affects us all in one way or another. That's what I wanted to say.
Thank you. That is so powerful and really important to highlight that men are also a victim of the system of patriarchy. And like I said earlier, sometimes women are pushed to uphold that system as well. So not every woman that you'll see is fighting against the patriarchal system, and not every man you'll come across is not a victim of that system either. So that's why we need, and everything in between, of course. So that's why we need to go beyond just seeing black and white in these issues. I'm going to pause here for a second and get either reactions from our students or questions. So you could ask our panelists, you could ask myself about what we have covered so far. It's a lot of information that we have shared, so I want to give you a chance to process it and see what questions you might be having. And you could drop them in the chat if you don't want to speak, but we would love to hear your voices.
Hi there. I just wanted to say I really resonated with the idea that, like a patriarchy affects men, because I know that's, the only experience I've had. And I know I don't specifically fit within the stereotype of some masculine features and, masculine identifiers. And I just thought it was a really interesting perspective to discuss, and I just really appreciated that. So I wanted to let you guys know.
Thank you. I wanted to say that I really also understand that, because I come from a nuclear family, where we're 3 girls. We don't have a brother. And in Sudanese culture, this was considered a huge thing, because when my mom had my youngest sister, my parents were still quite young. So there was a lot of pressure from the family for them to have a boy, and they decided not to, which you know, in the early 1980s, that was still is to an extent, but especially back then, it was considered a huge thing. And I grew up quite grateful that I didn't have a brother. And the reason that I was grateful that I didn't have a brother is because so many of my friends, you know, girlfriends, were they had their brothers were expected, even if they were younger than them, to put them in their place, to kind of govern them, to make sure that they behaved in the way they were supposed to behave. And I, growing up and having, you know, being directly friends with some of these boys that I knew back then, I realized how painful for some of them it was that they had to kind of behave this way, that they felt pressured by the father sometimes, by the mother, by their friends mostly, for them to, you know, if the sister was seen somewhere she wasn't supposed to be, to like put her in her place. And so I had always assumed that they were just being horrible, and they were being horrible, and they are being horrible. But I hadn't realized the way in which they kind of had to kill parts of themselves in order to be able to do that, because they were being bullied as well in some cases to do that. Don't get me wrong, some of them enjoyed it, but some of them really suffered for that. And I think it's also a good example of the ways in which patriarchy can be so painful. Also,
I mean, it could be as a small example as the pressure we put on young children not to cry. It's not mainly to cry. Men don't cry, which a lot of people just kind of hear that and walk away. They don't think too much about it. But if you think of like all the damage that it does to that individual, and the assumption of what maleness is and what it's not, and suppressing emotions and what it does to that individual all their life, but also to their family and to the people they connect with if they can't express who they are. On the other hand, you know, the expectation that girls are only going to get what they want if they're using their tears. I don't cry easily. Matter of fact, if there's a situation that's going to make me cry, because I saw that as weakness for a long time. Girls only got what they want if they cried. And I'm like, I'm not going to cry. And so for a long time, I distanced myself from that emotion for just so I don't be seen as a weak person, because I had a lot of other things to take care of, right? And so as an adult, having to relearn to connect with your emotions, right? And to your point, Liam, of if someone is not seen as you know, you don't look this certain gender, you're not feminine enough, you're not masculine enough. Let's make sure that we do everything in our power to get you to catch up to either your femininity or your masculinity. And it's often pushing people to change appearances, the way they act, the way they behave, the way they walk, a lot of things that cause a lot of psychological and emotional damage. So thank you for sharing that, and thank you for filling us in, Sarah. I'm gonna pause here and move us to the next section if we do not have any more questions or reactions to the conversation. Okay, we're covering so much. So we're gonna move to the second section, which is on gender equity and intersectionality, which we touched on earlier in our introduction. But I'm gonna again hand it over to Sarah to help us get a better definition of intersectionality. And sorry, I'm losing my spot here. Multitasking sometimes is not my thing. Intersectionality, whether we're talking about different forms of repression, generational intersectionality, that's a thing. Just walk us through what you have on intersectionality. And there's so much that goes into it, especially as we talk about an Arab American community that have just so many layers of identities.
Okay, so I think, Hasna's done a great job talking about it. I think for me, a couple of things I could add is that it's important to kind of keep in mind two things, I think, about intersectionality from my perspective. The first one is that it is true that African-American feminists, particularly in the 1970s and 1980s, coined this term. So Kimberly Crenshaw who was a law professor, coined this term in 1989. And it's this group that did the biggest amount of work to really advance an analysis of this. And I would say it has changed the face of feminism. It has changed the way that we think about gender, because it's very difficult now to think about gender as this kind of thing that's completely stripped away from everything else, of the way that it interacts with class or with sexual orientation or with ability and disability and so forth. But the idea itself is very old. I think we have to be careful, of course, that coining something doesn't mean that you originated it, and Kimberly Crenshaw makes this point herself. For example, I mean, there's some form of this analysis has been made by women activists and feminists in different places in the world for a very long time. In the context of the US, for example, the great abolitionist Sojourner Truth, born in 1797 and died in 1883. I know that a lot of you have already come across Sojourner Truth, probably, who was born into slavery and spent her life basically fighting for the equality of Blacks in this country, was already talking about intersectionality in 1851. I mean, there's the famous speech that I know I came across in high school, which was made in 1851 to the Women's Rights Convention in Akron, Ohio, where she asked the famous question, "Ain't I a woman?" I'm also going to put the link to that if you haven't come across this speech, but it defines what intersectionality is, because she was addressing this not just to men, but she was addressing it also to white women, the majority who were in this conference, saying, why aren't I considered also a woman? And that, in that sense, she was speaking about this intersection of her Blackness with her gender, right? Which excluded her not just from how men perceived her rights to be, but also how many white women, many of them, fighting for the rights of women, also excluded her and women like her from this. I think the second point I would like to make about intersectionality is that it's a really good framework to understand, I think, gender inequality in the Middle East and North Africa as well, not just here. But what's very important is that, and I think Hasna would make this point again and again, is that you can't take this color wheel and superimpose it somewhere else necessarily. Even within the US, the way this wheel would change, it would be different potentially from one community to another, right? So one thing we have to be careful about, because the US is so dominant culturally, so dominant in terms of the kinds of production that it makes to the rest of the world, the kind of influence it has, is that sometimes concepts are taken as they are and placed in places where they don't make sense. So while the framework itself makes sense in the region as well, it might shift based on what are these different oppressions? What are the oppressions? How do they look in that area? How do they intersect? They might intersect quite differently. So what I want to do now, I'm going to read a little bit of something in a second that is a reflection that I wrote recently about an intersection for me that's very important, which is a generational intersection. The difference between the kind of feminism I have and the kind of feminism my mom has. But before I do that, I wanted to just bring in some of the voices of actually women from the region. And as some of you might know, there's been a lot of change happening in the Middle East and North Africa in the last 10 years. And one of the big reasons is that social movements have become very powerful, starting with the Tunisian and Egyptian revolutions in 2010 and 2011. And this has had a really big influence on the kinds of activism, right, that is emerging by feminists, by women who are not identifying as feminists, and so forth. So the first video that we will watch a few minutes of, unfortunately, we can't watch the whole thing, but a couple of minutes, is this was a series that was done in 2012 where women who had participated in the Egyptian revolution, mostly young people, because the region is predominantly people, the region is, I think for the most part, something like 60 or 70% across the region are young people under the age of 25. That's the demographic. This is the first video, is just a few minutes by a Black Egyptian woman a young woman called Nada Zaytouna, who is speaking about, just the very beginning about her identity. So we'll watch a few minutes of this.
أنا ندى زيتونة، عندي 23 سنة. بعمل أفلام، بخرج أفلام. قبل 25 يناير كنت عايشة حياتي العادية، يعني بعمل أفلام، يعني بدرس حياتي العادية جدا، يعني ملهاش أي علاقة بالسياسة خالص يعني. واللي هو البلد خلاص رايحة فين، رايحة يمين، مش مهم يعني، قوقعة كده داخل نفسي خالص. اصلا عبال ما استوعب يعني ايه حد من اصحابنا يموت مقتول، كانت فكره غريبه شويه يعني، بغض النظر عن وسائل موتهم او وسائل حبسهم. وطبعا كتير قوي اتحبسوا من اصحابي اللي هم كانوا لسه قاعدين معايا من كام يوم. فلا يعني، فلا انا ما افهمش حاجه زي كده وما استوعبهاش، شيء تماما جديد. فاللي هو لا، انا مش طالعه البيت تاني. هو قعدت في الميدان، وماما بتتصل بيا بقول لها ان انا في اي حته. طبعا كنت بكدب عليها، وما كنتش ببات كل يوم. الايام اللي بقدر فيها اروح عند حد من اصحابي، كنا كلنا مهتمين ان احنا نبات مع بعض. انا طول عمري عايشه في العاصمه، تمام، في القاهره. فدايما كان بيتسأل السؤال، حتى لو مش ليا انا، لاخواتي او واختي، حد مثلا بنت محجبه شكلها مصري جدا وبتاع، بيتسأل لها برضو انتي مصريه ولا مش مصريه. فحسيت ان المصريين او الناس هنا ناسيين ان في جزء في الخريطه كده اسمه اسوان، من اول الاقصر، من اول الصعيد على فكره يعني، ناسيين وخلاص، ده مش من مصر. يا اما بيقولوا ايه ده انتي من سودانيه، ايه ده انتي من حته تانية، من دوله تانية. فاللي هو لا، احنا مصريين، احنا مصر. فده كان حسسني اكتر في السنوات في حياتي عموما ان انا مش قادره انتمي لمصر قوي. طب ما عشان اهلها كلهم بيعاملوني يعني انا مش من مصر. فهو بدات اسال، هو احنا منين، هو احنا تبع مين. ومساله العنصر، ان في عنصريه في مصر، في الشعب المصري يعني تجاه اهل النوبه او لا، صراحه في طبعا عنصريه كبيره جدا، عنصريه اجتماعيه وعنصريه سياسيه. ان وده موضوع يطول شرحه يعني، في مساله الاقصاء السياسي اللي حصل لاهالي الجنوب او للنوبيين عموما بعد موضوع السد. ان حصل اقصاء سياسي واقصاء اجتماعي عشان الناس دول ما يرجعوش يطالبوا بحقوقهم في الارض تاني، الارض اللي اتاخدت منهم بدون اي مقابل. عشان الناس دي تهجروا من بيوتهم، وغرق زرعهم واراضيهم وضاعت. وتم تعمد ان الناس دي تاريخهم يتمحي، وحتى لغتهم بتضيع. وطبعا التهمة الفظيعة اللي
All right, so Nada's, I think what's very interesting is there were many young women like herself who were not politically active prior to these. When she speaks about January 25th, this is January 25th, 2011, when there was the first call for a massive protest in Egypt. Egypt had been ruled by a military government for decades. And it was, nobody knew how many people would turn. And a lot of young people and young women like herself showed up for the first time, and the experience that they had during these social movements kind of revolutionized the way that they think, not just about their society, but about themselves. And I think what's really interesting, and the reason I picked this part, is because it shows that when Nada showed up in Tahrir Square, when Nada showed up in that place of the march, she was bringing her identity also as a Black Egyptian, the ways in which she's marginalized, also along with her identity as a woman and as a young person. You don't leave one at home and then come. And this changes your whole analysis in the way that you deal with this question of gender equality. She goes on, and I'll put the link to the interview if anybody wants to watch it later, to talk about what her experience was in detention as the only girl in a group of boys, and how is it as a girl that she was treated differently during detention. There's also a very short clip of, this is a series, as I said, of a young 18-year-old and her mom. And I think it's a good opening also to just a little bit of what I wanted to talk about. So we're gonna watch just a minute and a half, 2 minutes of this one.
اسمي منى صباحي، عندي 18 سنة، بدرس عمارة في فنون جميلة. أنا في لجنة المحكمات العسكرية المدنيين وفي اللجنة الشعبية للدفاع عن الثورة.
أنا اسمي حنان صادق، عندي 52 سنة، بشتغل في شركة خدمات بترول.
سمعت عن يوم 25 في فيسبوك في الإنترنت. كانت في ايفنت والناس كلها بتتكلم، وما كنتش ابدا يعني ساعتها فكرت انزل قبلها يعني، لغايه بس ما كانوا حاطين مانيول لو حد اتعور اتصلوا بكذا، لو حد محتاج محامي يكلموا كذا. ساعتها كان reassuring شويه. ساعتها بقيني قررت قبلها بيوم، وقعدت بقى بعت invitations للناس، بس ساعتها بقى لو كنت لسه مش فاهمه قوي، فاللي هو خايفه، فقلت المفروض اقول للناس ولا ما اقولهمش؟ طب امن الدوله هيجوا يعتقلوني ولا كده، ولا بس لو لا عادي يعني.
يعني قلت لها منى خليكي عاقله وتصرفي، ما ترميش روحك في حاجه بتهور يعني. بس ما كنتش قلقان يعني. كان شايفه الدعوات موجوده على الفيسبوك، زي ما عملنا في تونس بقى ننزل احنا كمان في مصر نعمل يعني الثوره اليوم الساعه كذا، اليوم الفلاني في الحته الفلانيه. كنت حاسه سورت اوف جوك يعني مش مستهترة بيها، بس يعني كان زي الوقفات بتاعت خالد سعيد اللي بنسمع عنها كتير، وحاول أنا أشترك فيها في مصر أو في اسكندرية. فما كانش في بالنسبة لي في الباك مايند يعني في تصوري أو في تخيلي أكتر من كده يعني. منى طبعا كانت رايحة بآمال كبيرة قوي مختلفة يعني، لأن هي كانت مشتركة بقالها 3 أيام بتسخن يعني وحاسة وعايشة في الجو. أنا ما كنتش هناك خالص، أنا كنت واحدة خايفة على بنتها اللي بتنزل شوية وترجع يعني. فبدينا 28 نزلت في وسط الناس وكانوا بيهتفوا.
That's it. We can stop. Thank you so much. So as women within these social movements learned, I mean, you see already there's a lot of more hesitancy by the mom than the daughter. And I think this is something that I've also felt in my own experience with my mom. I mean, I learned about the fight for gender equality from my mom and my aunts, but the type of expectations that my generation has had are so different from my mom's generation. For them, it was such a powerful thing already to be able to go to school, the ones who were able to. Some of my aunts were not still able to go to school, but many women were, including my mom. And for them, it was like, we get to work, we get to vote. In some cases, we go to work. While with my generation, this wasn't enough. And we see this tension also in my case with the migration. So I'm going to read just 1 minute of what I had written, this long reflection for a volume of different feminists from around the world reflecting on what does feminism mean today. So I wrote that, I wrote a little bit about myself. So I said, I was born in Khartoum, Sudan, and spent the first 11 years of my life there. Arabic was the first language I learned. There must have been a word in Arabic for feminism then, but as a child, I doubt I ever heard it. Today, I know the word, but it still feels odd on my tongue. I'm getting more used to saying nisawiya or niswiya, but a twinge of discomfort remains. It still feels a little alien, even to me. As we're seeing in the recent revolutions in Sudan, so that's in 2018, 2019, there's been another wave across the region. In Sudan, in Lebanon, and in Chile and elsewhere, feminism is being made into a powerful tool for emancipation through struggle. And feminists are exporting their own conceptions of what feminism means, which are powerful. As a feminist, my main concerns are how capitalism reinforces and creates racialized gender hierarchies, how poverty makes women more vulnerable to abuse, the murderous border regimes that are currently in place, and how women in the global South and working class women of color in the global North are treated as disposable. My feminism also asserts that Black women's lives matter, not just in the context of the US and Europe, but also in Sudan. But, and for me, I want to stop here and say, this is what's really important. This conception of Black for me changes whether I'm in the US or I'm in Sudan. It's not the same. So, for example, but also in the US, I am Black, so I have to struggle for space. But in Sudan, other women are Black, since my ethnicity there translates to racial privilege in that context. So the fact that I speak Arabic, the fact that I speak Arabic fluently, the fact that I come from particular groups places me as a Black person within Sudan on a higher hierarchy than someone who is Black, for example, who does not speak Arabic or speaks Arabic with an accent, right? And so there, the oppression of Black women is in part done in my name. So you can imagine what kind of there's a shift here from my experience growing up in the US. So racial oppression shifts across time and space, since there is no one racism, but rather multiple racisms. So racisms look differently in different places. I've realized that my own understanding of my role as a feminist also has to shift if it is to stay relevant in the multiple spaces that I inhabit. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sarah. And I could relate to your points on how gender equity and the struggle for it looked different for you than it did for your mother. And sometimes they don't realize how brave they were and the things they did, revolutionary things that they did. Yet they want to protect us and don't want us to go there. And then I definitely saw that in my own family, with my mother, with my grandmother, with my older sisters, some of the stories and the experiences they've had. I'm considered extremely privileged to where I am today compared to their own experiences. But when I try to, talk about gender equity or women's rights or whatever, they're like, oh, everything is fine. You don't need to put yourself, at risk. So thank you for sharing that.
Thank you.
Yeah, and for families that come from immigrant background, that's an additional layer to add, not only the generational difference, but also the immigration process. Add another layer to, I guess, to the identity, to that struggle, where it's not just the gender, it's now you're in a different place, where the younger person is more comfortable in that space, in their new home, and they, fully participate, including challenging that new home about the things that are not going right, whereas the older generation is not only coming from the older generation perspective, but also the fear based on immigration status or immigration experience that, yes, this is your home, but you're always going to be seen as the other. So I want to also give Hassanat a chance to take us a little bit deeper into the experience in the Gulf region, which I know that's where you did your work based on, you did your research based on the Gulf experience. Can you tell us about that, share us a little briefly about what you found, and if any of those experiences you're seeing any similarities in the US based on your work with Peaceful Families Project?
Thank you, Petra, and thank you, Sarah, for sharing. So yeah, I did my research in Kuwait. However, my research stems from my personal experience growing up in Saudi Arabia, where my family is originally from. I, grew up at the era where we didn't have access to internet, and, the regulations on women, on me personally, were much more stricter. I got married at the age of 18 just to escape my life with my older grandmother who raised me up. And the marriage didn't work out, and there was, physical abuse, there was sexual abuse, there was emotional abuse. And just as exactly what Sarah was saying, like, you know what feminism is, but you don't have a word yet for it. You're angry for a lot of injustices. This is not the way it should be, but you don't understand how to speak about it. You don't understand how to analyze it. You don't understand how to justify the anger that you're feeling. And so one of the first moments where I started to see my experience is not unique to me growing up in Saudi Arabia was when I accidentally worked as a journalist in an English language daily called Arab News. I started there as a translator, and then eventually I became interested in reporting. And so I learned on the job. I don't have a journalism background, but I had a degree in English. And so what did I report on? Issues that women struggle with, legal issues, in the system, the guardianship system, where men have basically full control over women's bodies and legal decisions and everything. Migrant workers' experiences, domestic workers and stuff. And so from there, I started seeing the structural issues behind everything. But again, I didn't have the terminology, the vocabulary, the feminist background, and the training to kind of do exactly what I wanted to do. In 2013, I decided to pursue my higher education. I came for a master's to ask questions about violence, about Islam, about culture in the US. It was my first time living as a US citizen because I was born here. So, but I didn't live as a US citizen. And so it was a weird experience in so many levels, trying to fit in. Because I never felt like I fit in the Saudi culture, but I never felt like I fit in the US culture. So kind of continue to live on the margins of both, which is, you know, it's good and it's bad in its own ways. But anyway, so I researched questions around Islam, violence, culture, religion, what causes violence, why does it happen? And the more I did my research and carried on to my PhD, the more I realized that there is this big gap in literature and English language when it comes to the Gulf region in particular. So many stereotypes, you know, it's an oil-rich countries, people are lazy, people are this. And what contributed to that something called the renters theory, which is a theory that a lot of men kind of created about the region, that, you know, because their welfare states, which is basically that the state provides to its own people, like, you know, free education, free healthcare, that the people end up relying on the government for everything. They become, you know, it's more like a rent that they exchange between the government and the people. And so they don't kind of call for any changes to happen. They're happy with the status quo. And that kind of hijacked the literature on the region. In addition to a lot of masculinist theories, that are gender blind, state-centric. The focus is always on the royal family and authoritarian regimes there. But then I've noticed that, like, the gender nuances, the lived experiences of people, the historical things that have been happening that were absent in English language literature. And so I did my research in Kuwait, and the only reason I went to Kuwait, because not Saudi Arabia, is because the Fulbright grant that I applied to, they don't send Saudi students to do research in Saudi Arabia. And I spent 10 months there. And despite me growing up in the region and knowing so much about the region, it was just amazing how much of an educational experience it was for me. I interviewed survivors, I interviewed advocates, and first of all, what I've learned is that the intersection of oppression and how it manifests itself in the local level in Kuwait was completely different yet similar to the US. So you have at the top of it, the violence that the state kind of perpetuates against what they call the Bedouin women. Bedouin are people who are stateless, who don't have any nationality or any form of ID, and they kind of experience the worst kind of violence. Violence against domestic workers. The kafala system, or the sponsorship system, where the employer has a right over their domestic workers. They live in the house, they have no access to a vacation, to rights, to legal protection. Number three, intergenerational trauma. Intergenerational trauma was a big thing in terms of, number one, the cycle of abuse within families that don't get talked about, and as a result of the Gulf War that hasn't been dealt with until today. And so that kind of manifests itself in relation to gender-based violence and so many other things. And so what I've learned is that violence is a global issue. It happens everywhere, including in the United States. I've served on a hotline in Worcester, Massachusetts as an advocate, and I know what it is like here. It's not something exceptional to any region in the world. However, there are different kind of structures that kind of create different experiences for women, or for men, or for even transgender women everywhere in the world. So yeah, I mean, the similarities and the connections is that violence is a global problem. The differences is how they manifest and what kind of lobbying that happens, support and resources that survivors and victims have access to. Definitely there's a huge gap in the region, and that goes back to that the discussion hasn't started there except for the past few years publicly. So yeah, I'll stop here.
Thank you. This is really helpful. I'm gonna pause here for a second and give whoever's left with us a chance to either comment or ask questions of the panelists. You could also put it in the chat. Okay, I'm not seeing anything come in. So I just want to share this very quickly with you. As mentioned earlier, I work for ISPU and we do research on American Muslims. And obviously the topic of, Muslim women and women in general is the most widely asked about topic of anything that we do. We do research on, for example, on Islamophobia. And so we ask questions based on stereotypes to see what the general public assume about American Muslims. And the most widely spread or most salient stereotype is that Muslims are misogynistic, as if they're inherently more misogynistic than other people. So there's just a lot related to this, but I want you to show you this specific graph here. This is both. So our research is a nationally representative survey. So we ask it of the general public, of Americans of all backgrounds, and then it include a representative sample of American Muslims, which you won't find with other research organizations. And then what we do is we break it down of, here's what the general public think, here's what American Muslims think, and then we could even give you the same data based on other faith communities. So you could see what other faith communities think about the same topic. So this specific question here was about the experience of gender discrimination, racial discrimination, and religious discrimination. Again, because the assumption is Muslim women are more discriminated against because they're Muslim, because they're women, and that somehow misogyny is inherently more present in the Muslim community and among Muslims than in other communities. And what you'll see here is the good news is that's not true. Muslims are not more misogynistic than any other faith community. The bad news is about 50% of women across the board, Muslim and non-Muslim, experience gender discrimination. So this is just a fact of life, unfortunately. But racial discrimination, and remember I mentioned earlier that Muslims are the most ethnically diverse faith community. I shared in the chat, a post about who are American Muslims. So you'll see it's made up of all racial and ethnic groups. Muslim women actually experience a higher level of racial discrimination, and they also experience a higher level of religious discrimination than women in the general public. So we're experiencing the same level of gender discrimination as other women, but we're also experiencing racial and religious discrimination at a disproportionate rate than other women in the general public. What that means is think of an African-American Muslim women experience versus, let's say, a Polish, I don't know, I'm going to get it wrong, a Polish Protestant woman who both live in the same community, what their experiences will look like. They both happen to be women, so they're going to experience the same level of discrimination, but the Muslim woman will experience more racial and more religious discrimination than her counterpart. And so I just wanted to leave this here for us to think about. Racial, gender discrimination is not inherited in one culture versus the other or one religion versus the other. Unfortunately, we all experience it across the board, but sometimes other parts of our identities make the experience worse for some of us than others. So on that note, let's move to something a little bit more hopeful and finish this conversation today. Let's talk about the future, because this is something that we all can have some control over. I'm not going to say we can't control because we can't control it, but we could control what we could do about it. So I want the students to think about what does the future of gender equity look like to you? And I'm going to come back to you and ask you that question, but I'm going to ask our panelists today. What does the future of gender equity look like? And what could we do about it? So let's keep this brief and start with Sarah.
Thank you. I'm going to keep it really brief because, yeah, I'm very keen to have this as a conversation for those that are still with those that are still here. For me, the videos that we showed a little bit earlier were from 2012. So very early in this wave within the region of uprisings. It wasn't the first time that there were uprisings, but that was the moment where the stereotype, not just outside the region, but within the region itself of, Arabs and people within that region like to live under authoritarianism. They don't like democracy. They like to be governed from the top. People showed that that was not true. And as difficult as this journey of the last 10 years is, I feel that the future of what gender equality looks like is coming today out of social movements. And what's really important to say is that social movements are learning. So we see that also in the US with the Black Lives Matter protests, with some of the protests that happened some years, in the last 10 years with undocumented people, also calling for their rights within this country, but also within the region. These same women that were speaking, if you listen further to the videos, they were fighting, right next to, men in the Tahrir Square in Tunis and other places, but they found that once the political changes started happening, they were excluded. And that was a process of learning where as particular women and feminists fighting within the region, they have a dual struggle, at least a dual struggle, depending on your identity. Somebody like Nade Zaytouna has multiple struggles that she has to deal with. But basically that it is really important to fight, it is not to delay this topic of feminism, because what women were told within social movements early is, yes, we know there's a problem about gender. We understand it, we think it's important, but it's not the time for it. Right now, we have to be unified. So it's kind of the know-how in how to wage this multiple struggle for rights simultaneously at the same time, which requires different tactics and different alliances. I feel that the visions coming out of this and the learning processes is where I get the most hope today when you look at the progress that has happened in terms of this kind of the fight for gender equity in the region and also in the US. What we're missing is the challenges, is the connections, basically, is to connect these different social movements, to connect these different struggles across borders. And that's where a lot of the challenges remain.
Thank you so much. That's really helpful. Hasna, tell us what do you see?
Well, history has taught us that this is an ongoing issue. It's going to continue. We need to continue working together. But what I want to, I agree with everything Sarah was said. But what I want to emphasize also is that when we're in the world doing the work that we do, who is not represented, whose voices are missing, especially in solidarity feminist spaces. Like yesterday, I'll give a brief example. There is this website for a school here, or a center that is mainly comprised of Arab Americans, and I look at the profiles and there's not a single person of color on that profile. And it just, we're still at that place where Muslims think of themselves as we're one. No, we need to see who's missing, why are they missing, and how can we combat these structures and bring in the voices of people who are, have been suppressed. And I think, we still, as you mentioned at the beginning, Petra, we think of Arabs as all Muslims, and Muslims are all Arabs, and all Arabs are all non-Black. And there's a lot of issues that we need to grapple with in kind of moving this, because we can no longer afford not to think of these intersections and how they manifest in the gender equity movement, how we stand up for each other, how we show up for each other, and how we reflect on our own blind spots, and bring this with a lot of humility, like, where have I done wrong? And it's okay, everybody makes mistakes. How can I do better? So that's what I'm gonna say.
Thank you, that's really, really helpful. And one thing I wanna add from our research is, and I think it's a really important piece. Obviously, there is just like earlier, we tried to clarify, not all Arabs are Muslims, not all Muslims are Arabs. And this is not to qualify one is good, one is bad. It's just a matter of fact. One is an ethnic, racial group. One is a religious identity. On the other hand, the assumption that Islam, for example, is bad for Muslim women. First of all, that is not a fact. That is not supported by what Muslim women themselves say. That's not what the research shows, especially in the American Muslim context, where Muslim women see their faith as actually, and in the world context, not just in American Muslim experience, where women see they see their faith as a source of happiness. It gives them purpose, it gives them meaning, and it helps them address all the challenges that are thrown at them. That does not mean that religion is not being used, just like Christianity, Judaism, and any other religion is being used to justify patriarchal societies and systems, and to continue to push discriminatory policies. But one of the ways to counter that is to help women become more educated about their own faith, and go back to the original sources, because that's where they gain the power and they gain the more independence. So I want to make sure that I add that there. And so, the connection between culture and theology is a whole topic that needs its own conversation. But what Muslim women tell us is that their faith is a source of happiness and inspiration for them, and a source of empowerment. So I'm going to stop us here and throw it back at whoever is left with us in the room to help us envision what the future looks like. What do you see when you see a gender equitable society? Feel free to drop it in the chat, or turn on your mic and share with us while we have a few minutes to wrap up the program. And or can you drop like a 1 or 2 word describe your feeling about today's program? Nothing? All right, so I want to thank our, okay, thank you. Thank you, Cynthia. I hope she really appreciated the examples of the intersectionality. Yes, there's so much more to be said about that, and it's such an important piece of that conversation. So on my end, I want to thank both Hasna and Sarah for this incredible conversation. Personally, I would like more and just sit and talk with the two of you. And there's so many topics that we could cover just with what we mentioned today. So this is not the end of our conversation. I hope the students and the teachers that were with us in the room benefited. I know we threw a lot of things at you. I know we brought up a lot of movements and conversations and topics, and we know you're going to take it all and process it, and hopefully dig in more on what we just shared with you. And I hope this is the beginning of the conversation, not the end of it. I want to thank Dave for inviting me, and the Arab American National Museum and the Smithsonian for putting this program together. And I'm going to hand it over back to Dave to wrap up the program. But thank you all. Thank you, Hasna, and thank you, Sarah.
Thank you, Petra, for the amazing moderation and contribution.
Absolutely. Thank you so much.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, thank you all so much for taking time out of your busy schedules. This was an amazing conversation. And like you all said, just kind of the beginning of these conversations. And again, our hope is that folks watching, the teachers, the educators, the students will continue to have like really deep and meaningful conversations that you all have sparked. And I'm so excited to like use the resources that you all shared, the color wheel, the bell hooks quote, like all of that is just like gold. So thank you all so much. And Petra for leading us through this conversation, and also like bringing up the amazing work that you do as well with ISPU. So, and thank you all so much for staying with us. So we're going to kind of close the program out. So again, a big thank you to everybody. Please continue to stay connected with our amazing panelists, with our amazing moderator, and of course with the Arab American National Museum. We have a lot of amazing programs coming up that are both in person and mostly online, including our upcoming Arab Film Festival taking place November 1st through 7th. Yes, so thank you for that. And we will be sending out a survey very shortly. So if you don't mind filling it out, that would be awesome as well. But again, thank you everybody so much for your time and enjoy the rest of your day.